My friend's dad likes to come into my room. I went to spend a week at my friend Liam's house, expecting nothing more than a relaxing time. But I wasn't prepared for him. His father, Ethan Carter, 40 years old, strong, charming, and intense in a way that unsettled me from the very first look. But the real problem started when he began coming into my room at night. At first, it was just casual conversations, a quick check-in. But night after night, those encounters became something more, something I couldn't tell anyone, not even Liam. What happens when your friend's dad can no longer resist? And what if you realize you can't either? This is a story about temptation, secrecy, and a line that should have never been crossed. Before we dive into this intense story, make sure to subscribe to the channel, like this video, and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next chapter. Now, let's begin. At 22, I had never found myself in such an unsettling situation. When my friend Liam invited me to spend a week at his house, I didn't think twice. I needed a break, and the idea of staying in a huge house with a pool and home-cooked meals sounded perfect. But what I didn't expect was to feel this strange pull inside me the moment I met his father. His name was Ethan Carter, 40 years old, tall, built like a man who had spent years in control. He had the kind of presence that filled a room without effort. His handshake was firm, his voice deep and calm, and the way he held eye contact just a little too long sent a flicker of something through me I didn't want to acknowledge. "Good to have you here," he said when I first arrived, his voice smooth, unreadable. For a moment, I felt like he was analyzing me, trying to figure me out. Then, just as quickly, he turned away, casual as ever, as if nothing had happened. But something had. The house. Liam's house was massive. A 2-story, modern build with an open floor plan, huge windows, and a pool in the backyard. My room was upstairs, down the hall from Liam's, but right next to Ethan's home office. From the start, there was an odd energy whenever Ethan was around. He was polite, always polite, but his presence was heavy. I caught him looking at me a few times, nothing obvious, just small moments, a flicker of interest in his eyes before he looked away. I told myself I was imagining things. Until the first night. The first night. Liam had gone to bed early, exhausted from the long day. I stayed up in my room, scrolling through my phone, when I heard a soft knock at my door. I thought it was Liam at first, maybe coming to talk or borrow something. But when I opened the door, it was him. Ethan stood there in the dim hallway light, wearing nothing but a black t-shirt and gray sweatpants. He looked casual, too casual, like he hadn't planned on coming here. But something made him do it anyway. "Everything okay in here?" he asked, voice low. I swallowed. "Yeah, just getting settled." He leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed over his broad chest. "Good. If you need anything, let me know." His gaze flickered over me just for a second, then he smirked slightly, not in a friendly way, but in a way that felt almost testing. Then he turned and walked away. I stood there for a long moment, my pulse hammering for no good reason. Why had he come to check on me? And why did it feel like something had just shifted between us? The next morning, I convinced myself that Ethan's late-night visit had meant nothing. He was just being a good host, checking in, making sure I was comfortable. That's what I told myself. But something felt different at breakfast. Liam was still half asleep, barely paying attention as he shoveled cereal into his mouth. But Ethan? Ethan was watching me. Not in an obvious way, but I could feel it. Every time I glanced up from my plate, his eyes would be on me, just for a second too long before he looked away. "Did you sleep well?" he asked, his voice calm, unreadable. I nodded. "Yeah, The bed's comfortable. Ethan's lips twitched slightly. Good. That was it. Nothing strange, nothing inappropriate. But the way he said it made my stomach tighten. I wasn't imagining things. In the pool, later that afternoon, Liam suggested we go for a swim. The sun was brutal, and the clear blue water looked too good to resist. As we splashed around, messing around like we always did, Ethan walked onto the patio, wearing only a pair of black swim trunks. And that's when I realized just how built he was. Broad chest, strong arms, defined abs. He looked like a man who had always been in control of his body, and probably in control of everything else, too. He sat on a lounge chair, sunglasses hiding his eyes. But I knew. I could feel him watching me, and when I climbed out of the pool, water dripping down my skin, I saw it. Just for a second. His jaw clenched. His grip on the armrest tightened. And then, as if catching himself, he looked away. That was the moment I knew. This wasn't just in my head. Ethan Carter wanted me. The second night, I couldn't sleep. My mind kept replaying the way Ethan had looked at me, like he was trying not to look, like he was fighting something. I should have ignored it. I should have stayed in bed. But instead, I opened my door. The hallway was quiet. Liam's door was shut, his room dark. But further down the hall, outside Ethan's office, there was a faint glow of light. I stepped out. I didn't know why. Maybe I just wanted proof. Maybe I wanted to see if he'd look at me again the way he had earlier. I reached his door and stopped. Through the gap, I could see him sitting at his desk, leaning back in his chair, shirtless. He wasn't working. He was staring at the ceiling, his jaw tense, his fingers gripping the armrest like he was wrestling with a thought he didn't want to have. Like he was wrestling with me. I swallowed hard. I should go back to my room. But then, his head turned. Our eyes met, and for the first time, he didn't look away. I should have walked away. The second Ethan saw me standing there, half hidden in the dim light of the hallway, I should have gone back to my room and locked the door. But I didn't. I stood there, my pulse pounding in my throat as he held my gaze. There was no confusion in his expression, no embarrassment, just something dark and unreadable in those piercing blue eyes. He wasn't surprised that I was watching him, and worse, I wasn't surprised that he wasn't. The moment that changed everything. Slowly, Ethan sat up in his chair, resting his elbows on his desk. He didn't move toward me, didn't say a word, but he didn't look away either. Neither did I. The air in the hallway felt thick, charged with something I didn't understand. But my body did. My skin was burning, my breath shallow. Then, finally, he moved. Not much. Just a slow tilt of his head, like he was testing me. Seeing how long I'd stay there. Seeing if I'd run. I should have. But instead, I took a step forward. Not much. Just a shift of my foot, a tiny movement that barely meant anything. But to him, it meant everything. His lips parted slightly, his chest rising and falling with a breath I wasn't sure he meant to take. For the first time since I'd met him, Ethan Carter looked unsteady, and it was because of me. The sound that brought us back. Then, a noise from downstairs. Liam's voice, groggy, calling out from his room. The spell broke. Ethan's jaw clenched, and in an instant he turned his chair away, like nothing had happened, like we hadn't just stood there, locked in something undeniable. I forced my feet to move, back to my room, back to the bed where I lay awake for hours, staring at the ceiling, trying to convince myself that whatever had just happened hadn't. But I knew better, and so did he. The next morning, I told myself it was over. Whatever had happened last night, whatever that look meant, it was just a moment. A strange, unspoken moment between two people who should have never shared one. I forced myself to act normal at breakfast. Liam was his usual self, complaining about how little sleep he got, scrolling through his phone like nothing had changed. But Ethan was different. He didn't look at me. Not once. The same man who had held my gaze like a silent challenge the night before now sat across from me, sipping his coffee, perfectly unreadable. No tension, no flickers of hesitation. It was like he'd erased everything that happened, and I should have been relieved. Instead, I felt restless. Why was I waiting for him to look at me? The lingering touch. Later that afternoon, Liam and I were heading out to grab food. He was already by the door, tying his sneakers, when Ethan walked past me in the hallway. For the first time all day, his eyes met mine. Just a second. A brief, almost imperceptible glance, but then his hand brushed my arm. It wasn't an accident. It wasn't a mistake. It was slow, deliberate. And then he was gone. I stood there, heart pounding, skin tingling where he'd touched me. What the hell was he doing? The second night, I couldn't sleep. Again. I wasn't sure if I was waiting for something or if I just couldn't stop replaying that look, that touch. At some point, I got up to get water. And when I opened my door, I nearly froze. Ethan's door was slightly open. Not much. Just enough. Enough to see him sitting at the edge of his bed, shirtless, hands in his hair, like he was fighting something he didn't want to admit. Like he was waiting for me. I could have ignored it, walked away, pretended I never saw, but I didn't. I stepped forward, his head lifted, his eyes found mine. And this time, he didn't stop me. I should have walked away. Every part of me screamed that this was dangerous, that stepping closer to that half-open door was a mistake I wouldn't be able to undo, but I moved anyway. The space between Ethan and me shrank until I was right there, in the doorway of his room, staring at him in the dim light. He sat on the edge of the bed, his elbows resting on his knees, his bare chest rising and falling with slow, measured breaths. His face was shadowed, unreadable, but his eyes burned. He didn't tell me to leave. He didn't pretend this wasn't happening. Instead, he tilted his head slightly, his gaze flickering over me before settling on my face. And then, finally, he said, "Close the door." My fingers trembled as I reached for the handle. One simple movement, and everything would change. The door clicked shut behind me. Silence. Thick, heavy, suffocating. Ethan let out a breath, running a hand through his dark hair before looking up at me again. "You know this is wrong, right?" His voice was low, controlled, but I could hear the tension beneath it. I swallowed hard. "Then why did you leave the door open?" His jaw tightened. "I shouldn't have." "But you did." Ethan exhaled sharply, his gaze darkening. He stood slowly, and I felt the air shift as he moved closer. My pulse was pounding, but I didn't step back. We were too close now. "This can't happen," he murmured. I nodded, even as my chest ached with the weight of the lie. "And yet, here you are," I said. His lips pressed together, like he was trying to fight something inside him. "You don't understand what you're playing with." "Then stop me." Ethan's breath hitched. For a moment, I thought he was going to, but instead, he just stood there, his resolve cracking right in front of me. And then, just as I thought he would step away, he did the exact opposite. He reached for me. His fingers brushed against my wrist, barely touching, but the feeling was electric. I sucked in a breath, my skin burning where he touched me. He didn't pull away. Neither did I. The point of no return. His fingers slid up my forearm, slow and hesitant, like he was testing himself, testing me. Every inch of my skin felt like it was on fire. "Tell me to stop," Ethan murmured. I parted my lips, but the words wouldn't come. I couldn't tell him to stop, because I didn't want him to. His hand tightened around my arm, his grip firm but not forceful. His thumb brushed against my pulse, and I knew he could feel how fast it was racing. "This is insane," he muttered. I exhaled a shaky breath. "Then why aren't you letting go?" Ethan's jaw clenched. "Because I don't want to." His confession sent a shiver through me. This wasn't just in my head. This was real. The sound that ruined everything. Then, a noise from the hallway. Liam's voice. Both of us tensed instantly. Ethan dropped my arm like it had burned him, taking a sharp step back. I stumbled, my breath uneven as my brain caught up with what just happened. Footsteps. Liam was moving. I turned, reaching for the doorknob just as Ethan did the same. Our hands collided, a final jolt of electricity between us. We froze. His eyes locked onto mine. "Go," he whispered. I barely had time to open the door and slip out before Liam's bedroom door creaked open behind me. I turned the corner, heart pounding so hard I could barely breathe. I had almost been caught. But worse than that? I had just crossed a line I could never uncross. And I had a feeling Ethan Carter wasn't done with me yet. I barely slept. Lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, my skin still burned from where he had touched me. My mind kept replaying it, the way his fingers had wrapped around my wrist, the way his breathing had changed when I didn't tell him to stop, the way he had looked at me before I left his room. I should have felt guilty. Liam was sleeping just down the hall, unaware of what had almost happened between his father and me. But guilt wasn't the strongest thing inside me right now. It was need. And from the way Ethan had looked at me, I knew he felt it too. But what now? Would he act like nothing had happened? Would I? I had my answer the next night. The final night. Liam had gone out with some friends, leaving me alone in the house with Ethan. It was our last night before I had to leave. The tension had been thick all day. Ethan barely spoke to me, his expression unreadable, his body language stiff. But I felt it, the weight of what we weren't saying. And I knew, deep down, that tonight was going to be different. I was right. It was past midnight when I heard it, the door creaking open. My breath hitched. I turned over in bed, my pulse hammering, and saw it. Ethan standing in the doorway. He didn't knock. He didn't ask if I was awake. He just stepped inside. The air in the room grew thick as he slowly closed the door behind him, leaving us alone in the dim light of the bedside lamp. He was barefoot, wearing only sweatpants and a loose t-shirt. His expression was calm, controlled, but his eyes told a different story. I sat up slowly. "Ethan?" "Don't," he said, his voice rougher than usual. "Don't say my name like that." Like what? Like it meant something? Like I was afraid of what would happen if I did? I swallowed hard. "Why are you here?" He exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair before shaking his head. "I don't know," he admitted. "I shouldn't be." "But you are." His eyes flickered to mine, filled with something dangerous. A moment of silence. Then, he moved, slowly, carefully. He walked to the side of my bed, stopping just close enough that I could feel the warmth radiating off him. "This is wrong," he murmured. I nodded, my breath shallow. "Yeah." Neither of us moved. Neither of us left. Ethan's jaw tightened. "Tell me to go." I parted my lips. The words were right there. I could have ended this, but I didn't. Instead, I reached for him. My fingers curled around his wrist, mirroring the way he had grabbed mine the night before. He inhaled sharply, his entire body tensed, like he was about to pull away. But he didn't. Instead, his hand covered mine, his thumb brushing against my palm. A silent choice, a silent confession. Then, a noise outside. The unmistakable sound of a car pulling into the driveway. Liam. Reality slammed back into us. Ethan jerked back, his breath unsteady. He raked a hand through his hair, turning away like he couldn't stand to look at me. "This can't happen," he muttered. I swallowed the lump in my throat. "I know." He exhaled, shaking his head. "You should leave tomorrow morning. Early." It wasn't a request. It was an order. I felt something inside me tighten, but I nodded. Ethan turned, walking toward the door. He hesitated, hand on the knob, his shoulders tense. And then, without looking back, he left. The next morning, I packed my things before the sun even rose. Liam barely noticed, groggy as he helped me load my bag into the car. "Leaving so soon?" he yawned. I forced a smile. "Yeah, early shift at work." He nodded, hugging me briefly before stepping back. "We'll do this again, man." I glanced toward the house one last time. The curtains in Ethan's office were drawn. He wasn't going to come out. He wasn't going to say goodbye. I should have felt relieved. This was the right thing. But as I drove away, my chest felt hollow. Because I knew one thing for certain. This wasn't over. Not even close. I told myself I wouldn't think about him. I told myself leaving was the right thing. But days passed, then weeks, and Ethan never left my mind. I should have been moving on, but instead I found myself replaying every glance, every touch, every almost. One night I got a text from Liam. "My dad asked about you today." My breath caught. I stared at the screen for a long time, my pulse hammering. So he was thinking about me, too. Chapter 8. Temptation Never Leaves. I swore I wouldn't go back. But then, one night, after too many restless hours, I found myself dialing his number. I didn't expect him to pick up. But he did. The silence between us was deafening. Then, finally, in that deep, familiar voice, "You shouldn't have called." I swallowed hard. "I know." A beat of silence. Then, quietly, like he was fighting himself, "Come back." I don't know why I went. Maybe I needed closure. Maybe I needed him. When I arrived, the house was dark, except for one light in his office. I walked in, heart pounding. Ethan was standing there, hands in his pockets, eyes locked onto mine. I didn't move. Neither did he. But we both knew. This wasn't the end. It was only the beginning.